The small town of Coldwater, Mississippi, existed as little more than a crossroads in the spring of 1950. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors remained unlocked at night, and where the biggest news of the week might be who brought the best pie to the church social on Sunday. The town square featured a modest courthouse with whitewashed columns, a general store that sold everything from flour to fabric, a barber shop where men gathered to discuss crops and weather, and a diner called Mabel's where the coffee was always hot and the gossip flowed freely. Cotton fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and the people who worked those fields lived lives dictated by the rhythms of planting and harvest. In this quiet corner of the Deep South, nobody could have imagined that a crime committed in the summer of 1950 would remain unsolved for more than 7 decades, or that when justice finally arrived, it would tear the very fabric of the community apart in ways that even the original tragedy could not. The victim was a woman named Dorothy Mee Hutchins, though everyone in Coldwater called her Dot. She was 26 years old in the spring of 1950, married to a man named William Hutchins who worked at the Cotton Gin, and mother to 2 young daughters aged 4 and 6. Dot worked part-time at the general store, where she was known for her warm smile and her ability to remember every customer's usual order. She sang in the church choir every Sunday, her voice a clear soprano that could be heard above all the others. She baked pies for church fundraisers and volunteered to watch neighbor children when their mothers needed help. By all accounts, Dorothy Mee Hutchins was exactly the kind of person who made a small town feel like home. She had grown up in Coldwater, attended the one-room schoolhouse that still stood at the edge of town, married her high school sweetheart, and never expressed any desire to live anywhere else. Her entire world existed within a radius of about 10 miles, and that world seemed safe and predictable until the night of June 15, 1950. On that night, Dorothy Mee told her husband she was going to walk to her sister's house about half a mile down the road. Her sister Clara had just had a baby, and Dot wanted to bring over a basket of food and check on how the new mother was managing. It was around 7:30 in the evening, still light outside with that golden glow that comes just before sunset in the South during summer. William was watching their daughters, and he remembered standing on the front porch as Dot walked down their dirt driveway carrying that basket, her floral print dress swaying as she walked, her hair tied back with a yellow ribbon. He remembered waving to her, and he remembered that she turned back once to wave at him before she disappeared around the bend in the road. That was the last time William Hutchins saw his wife alive. When Dorothy Mee hadn't returned by 10 o'clock that evening, William began to worry. He bundled up his daughters and drove them over to Clara's house, expecting to find Dot there caught up in conversation about the new baby. But Clara looked confused when William appeared at her door. Dot had never arrived, Clara said. She had been expecting her sister all evening, but assumed Dot had gotten tired or the girls needed something. William felt the first cold finger of fear touch his spine. The route between the two houses was straightforward, just a half-mile of rural road with fields on either side. There was nowhere for someone to get lost, no reason for someone to simply vanish. William drove back along that road slowly, his headlights cutting through the darkness, looking for any sign of his wife. He saw nothing unusual. No basket dropped in the road, no torn piece of clothing, no indication that anything had happened. He went home hoping she might have returned by some route he hadn't considered, but the house was dark and empty. By midnight, William had called the sheriff, a man named Robert Tucker who had held the position for nearly 15 years. Sheriff Tucker took the report seriously despite some initial assumptions that Dorothy Mee might have simply decided to visit someone else or had taken ill at a neighbor's house. But as Tucker and his deputy drove the route between the Hutchins home and Clara's house in the early hours of June 16th, they found something that made William's worst fears real. About a quarter-mile from the Hutchins house, just where the road curved near a stand of pine trees, they found the basket. It was lying on its side in the ditch, its contents scattered. A jar of preserves had shattered, a loaf of bread lay in the dirt, and Dot's yellow hair ribbon was tangled in the grass a few feet away. There were signs of a struggle. The dirt and grass were disturbed, and there were what appeared to be drag marks leading from the road into the pine trees. Sheriff Tucker organized a search party at first light. Nearly every able-bodied man in Coldwater showed up at the courthouse square that morning, grim-faced and determined. They spread out through the pine forest and the cotton fields, calling Dorothy Me's name, looking for any trace of her. The search continued through the morning and into the afternoon heat. It was a farmer named Jesse Coleman who found her. She was lying in a shallow ravine about 200 yards from where the basket had been discovered, concealed partially by undergrowth and fallen branches. Someone had made an attempt to hide the body, but not a very thorough one. Dorothy Mee Hutchins had been strangled, her neck marked with deep bruises that indicated powerful hands had squeezed the life from her. Her dress was torn, and it was clear she had fought hard against her attacker. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, scratches and bruises that told the story of a woman who had not died easily. The news of Dot's murder swept through Coldwater like wildfire. The small town had never experienced anything like this before. There had been accidents, illnesses, even the occasional fight at the local tavern that resulted in injuries, but deliberate murder was something that happened in big cities, not in places like Coldwater. The funeral was held 3 days later at the First Baptist Church, and it seemed like the entire town attended. The church was so crowded that people stood outside in the heat, men holding their hats in their hands, women weeping into handkerchiefs. William Hutchins looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 days, his face hollow and gray. His 2 daughters sat beside him in matching black dresses, too young to fully understand that their mother was never coming home. The Reverend spoke about senseless tragedy and the mysterious ways of the Lord, but his words provided little comfort. How could they? A young woman had been murdered on a country road in the early evening, and nobody had seen anything, nobody had heard anything, and nobody had any idea who could have done such a thing. Sheriff Tucker launched what was, by small-town standards, an extensive investigation. He interviewed dozens of people, anyone who might have been on that road on the evening of June 15th, anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. He examined the crime scene multiple times, looking for clues that might have been missed in the initial search. He sent the few pieces of physical evidence they had to the state crime lab in Jackson, though forensic science in 1950 was primitive compared to what would come later. There were no fingerprints that could be lifted, no DNA testing, no security cameras or cell phone records. The investigation relied entirely on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be seen with the naked eye, and the sheriff's instincts about human nature. In the weeks following the murder, several theories emerged. Some people believed it was a stranger, perhaps a drifter or someone passing through town who had seen Dorothy Mee walking alone and attacked her on impulse. This theory provided a certain comfort because it meant the killer was likely far away by now, that Coldwater was not harboring a murderer within its own population. But Sheriff Tucker was skeptical of this explanation. The road where Dot had been attacked was not a main highway. It was a rural route used almost exclusively by local residents. A stranger would have had no reason to be there, and the timing suggested someone who knew Dot's habits, who might have known she would be walking that road that evening. Another theory focused on William Hutchins himself. In murder investigations, the husband is always a suspect, and some people whispered that perhaps William had killed his wife and staged the scene to make it look like a random attack. But Sheriff Tucker investigated this possibility thoroughly and found nothing to support it. William had been home with his daughters all evening, the neighbors confirmed seeing him there, and his grief appeared completely genuine. There was no evidence of marital problems, no financial motive, no hint of another woman or any reason William might want his wife dead. A third theory, one that was discussed more quietly and usually only in private, suggested that Dorothy Mee might have been involved with someone, that perhaps she was meeting a lover and something had gone terribly wrong. But this theory had no basis in fact. Everyone who knew Dot described her as devoted to her family, faithful to her husband, and not the kind of woman who would conduct a secret affair. The theory persisted anyway, the way ugly rumors often do, because people struggle to make sense of senseless violence, and sometimes they create narratives that blame the victim, rather than accepting that evil can strike anyone at any time. As the weeks turned into months and no arrest was made, the investigation began to lose momentum. Sheriff Tucker followed every lead he had, but they all led nowhere. The case remained open, but it grew cold. By the fall of 1950, life in Coldwater had begun to return to something resembling normal, though the normal was changed. Parents no longer let their children roam freely the way they once had. Women were nervous about walking alone, even in daylight. Door locks that had rarely been used were now engaged every night. The murder of Dorothy Mee Hutchins had stolen something from the town, some innocence or sense of safety that could never quite be restored. William Hutchins eventually moved away with his daughters, unable to bear living in the house where he had last seen his wife alive. The Hutchins house stood empty for several years before another family moved in, and even then, people said it had a sad feeling about it, as if the walls remembered the tragedy. Sheriff Tucker retired in 1962, and on his last day in office, he told his successor that the Hutchins case was his greatest regret, the one failure that had haunted him throughout his career. The case file was boxed up and stored in the basement of the courthouse, where it gathered dust alongside other old records and forgotten documents. Decades passed. The people who had known Dorothy Mee Hutchins grew old and died. Her daughters grew up without any real memory of their mother, only the stories they had been told and the fading photographs they kept in albums. William Hutchins remarried eventually and tried to build a new life, but those who knew him said he was never quite the same, that something in him had broken on that June night in 1950. Coldwater changed too, though more slowly than the rest of the world. The general store closed in the 1970s, replaced by a small supermarket. The cotton gin shut down as agriculture in the region shifted. New families moved in, people who had never heard of Dorothy Mee Hutchins and had no idea that a murder had once shaken this quiet community to its core. The case became a piece of local history, occasionally mentioned by older residents but largely forgotten by younger generations. It seemed destined to remain forever unsolved, another cold case lost to time. But in the spring of 2023, something happened that would change everything. A young woman named Sarah Reeves was working on her graduate thesis in criminal justice at the University of Mississippi. Her focus was cold cases, specifically murder cases from the 1940s and 50s that had never been solved. She was interested in how limitations in forensic technology had hampered investigations, and whether modern techniques might be able to shed new light on old mysteries. Sarah came across the Dorothy Mee Hutchins case while researching in the state archives. Something about the case captured her attention. Perhaps it was the ordinariness of the victim, a young mother walking to her sister's house on a summer evening. Perhaps it was the lack of any clear motive or suspect. Or perhaps it was simply the tragedy of a case that had consumed a community but had never been resolved. Whatever the reason, Sarah decided to make the Hutchins case the centerpiece of her thesis. She began by tracking down the old case file, which took considerable effort. The file had been moved multiple times over the decades, from the courthouse basement to a county storage facility and finally to the state archives. When Sarah finally got her hands on the documents, she found them brittle with age and partially damaged by moisture and time. But there was still information to be gleaned. She read Sheriff Tucker's reports, his interviews with witnesses, his notes and theories. She studied the crime scene photographs, which were grainy black and white images that showed the scattered basket, the disturbed earth, the location where the body had been found. She made a list of everyone who had been interviewed, everyone who had been considered a suspect, everyone who might have had information. Many of these people were long dead, but Sarah was determined to be thorough. One name kept appearing in the margins of Sheriff Tucker's notes. The name was written several times, sometimes circled, sometimes followed by question marks. The name was Thomas Pritchard. Sarah began to research who Thomas Pritchard had been. She discovered that in 1950, he had been a respected member of the Coldwater community. He had owned a successful farm, served as a deacon at the First Baptist Church, and was known as a pillar of the community. He was married with 3 children, and by all outward appearances, he was the epitome of a successful and righteous man. But Sheriff Tucker's notes suggested that he had been interested in Pritchard as a potential suspect. The notes were cryptic, but they indicated that Pritchard had been seen on or near the road where Dorothy Mee was attacked around the time of her murder. Tucker had interviewed Pritchard multiple times, and each time Pritchard had claimed he was working in his fields that evening and had not seen or heard anything unusual. Several neighbors had corroborated his alibi, saying they had seen him working late into the evening. Sarah found it interesting that despite these alibis, Sheriff Tucker had continued to make notes about Pritchard. There were references to inconsistencies in timeline and need to verify neighbor statements more thoroughly. But apparently Tucker had never been able to develop enough evidence to take any action against Pritchard. The investigation had stalled, and Pritchard had lived out the rest of his life as a respected citizen of Coldwater. He had died in 1989 at the age of 73, never having been charged with any crime. But Sarah's instincts told her that there was something here worth pursuing. She decided to try to track down people who had known Thomas Pritchard, particularly anyone who might remember the time around Dorothy Mee's murder. This is where Sarah's investigation took an unexpected turn. She managed to locate a woman named Helen Morrison who was living in a nursing home in Jackson. Helen was 96 years old, and her memory was not always reliable, but she had grown up in Coldwater and had clear memories of the summer of 1950. More importantly, Helen had been the daughter of one of Thomas Pritchard's neighbors, the same neighbor who had provided Pritchard with an alibi. When Sarah visited Helen and began asking about the murder of Dorothy Mee Hutchins, the old woman became agitated. She asked Sarah to close the door to her room, and then, in a voice that shook with emotion, she told Sarah something that she had kept secret for more than 70 years. Helen said that her father had lied about seeing Thomas Pritchard working in his fields on the evening of June 15, 1950. Pritchard had come to their house late that night, Helen said, and had spoken with her father in hushed, urgent tones on the front porch. She had been a young girl at the time, supposed to be asleep, but she had crept to the window and listened. She couldn't hear everything that was said, but she heard enough to understand that Pritchard was asking her father to lie for him, to say that he had seen Pritchard working in his fields if anyone asked. Helen's father had agreed, and in the days that followed, when Sheriff Tucker had come asking questions, her father had provided exactly the alibi that Pritchard needed. Sarah was stunned. She asked Helen why her father had agreed to lie for Pritchard, why he had helped conceal what might have been evidence in a murder investigation. Helen explained that Thomas Pritchard had been a powerful man in Coldwater, wealthy and well-connected. Her father had been a sharecropper who farmed land that Pritchard owned. To refuse Pritchard anything would have meant losing their home, their livelihood, everything. So her father had lied, had carried that lie for the rest of his life, and had made his family complicit in the silence. Helen said she had wanted to tell the truth many times over the years, but she had been afraid. Afraid of what it would mean for her family, afraid that no one would believe her, afraid of stirring up trouble in a community that wanted to forget. But now, in her 90s, with most of the people involved long dead, she felt she could finally speak. She told Sarah that she had lived with guilt for 7 decades and that she wanted the truth to be known before she died. Armed with this information, Sarah contacted the Mississippi Attorney General's office and the State Bureau of Investigation. She presented her research, including Helen Morrison's testimony, and argued that the Dorothy Mee Hutchins case deserved to be reopened. There was considerable skepticism at first. The case was more than 70 years old, the primary suspect had been dead for over 30 years, and most of the witnesses and evidence were long gone. But Sarah was persistent, and she had allies in the form of prosecutors who specialized in cold cases and believed that justice had no statute of limitations. Eventually, the case was formally reopened. Investigators began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct what had happened in 1950 and determine whether there was enough evidence to establish what Thomas Pritchard had done. The investigation took more than a year. Detectives tracked down descendants of the original witnesses, hoping to find others like Helen Morrison who might have knowledge that had been kept secret. They re-examined the old physical evidence using modern forensic techniques, though much of it had deteriorated beyond usefulness. They researched Thomas Pritchard's life in detail, looking for any pattern of behavior that might support the theory that he had been capable of murder. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture. Several elderly women came forward, cautiously and with great reluctance, to report that Thomas Pritchard had made unwanted advances toward them when they were young. One woman said that Pritchard had assaulted her in his barn when she was 16 and working as seasonal help on his farm. She had never reported it because she knew no one would believe her word against his. Another woman told a similar story. The pattern suggested that Pritchard had been a sexual predator who used his power and position to victimize vulnerable women and girls, and that the community had either been unaware or had chosen to look the other way. The more investigators dug into the case, the more convinced they became that Thomas Pritchard had indeed murdered Dorothy Mee Hutchins. They theorized that he had seen her walking alone that evening and had seized the opportunity to attack her. Perhaps he had made advances that she rejected, perhaps he had intended to assault her and she had fought back, or perhaps the attack had been entirely opportunistic and violent from the start. Whatever the specific circumstances, the evidence pointed to Pritchard as the killer, but there was a problem. Thomas Pritchard was dead. He had been in his grave for more than 3 decades. There could be no arrest, no trial, no conviction, no justice in the traditional sense. The investigation seemed destined to conclude with a determination of who was responsible but no ability to hold that person accountable. Then, in the summer of 2024, investigators made a discovery that would shatter the Coldwater community once again. During their research into Thomas Pritchard's family, they learned that he had had 3 children. 2 of them had died years ago, but one was still alive. His youngest child, a son named Thomas Pritchard Jr., was still living in Coldwater at the age of 76. Jr., as everyone called him, had lived his entire life in his father's shadow. He had inherited the farm, though it was much smaller now with most of the land sold off over the years. He was a fixture in the community, known as a quiet and somewhat reclusive man who mostly kept to himself. He had never married, had no children, and seemed content to live out his days in the old Pritchard farmhouse where he had grown up. As investigators interviewed Jr. about his father, they noticed something troubling. When asked about the night of Dorothy Mee Hutchins' murder, Jr. became evasive and agitated. He was only 6 years old at the time, he said, and he didn't remember anything about it. But investigators pressed him, asking if he remembered anything unusual about his father's behavior that summer, anything that stood out in his memory. Jr. insisted he remembered nothing, but his body language and his nervous evasions told a different story. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the old Pritchard farmhouse, looking for any evidence that might have been preserved over the decades. What they found was unexpected and horrifying. In the attic, hidden in an old trunk beneath layers of moth-eaten clothing and yellowed newspapers, they found a journal. The journal had belonged to Thomas Pritchard Sr., and it contained entries dating from the 1940s through the late 1980s. Many of the entries were mundane, recording details of farm work and weather and church activities. But scattered throughout the journal were other entries that described violent fantasies and confessions of terrible acts. The entry from June 16, 1950, was particularly damning. In it, Thomas Pritchard had written about encountering Dorothy Mee Hutchins on the road the previous evening. He had written about his desire for her, about how he had approached her and tried to convince her to come with him to his barn. He had written about her refusal, her anger, her threat to tell her husband and the sheriff. And he had written about how he had grabbed her, how she had fought, and how he had strangled her to silence her. The entry was detailed and horrific, describing not only the murder but also Pritchard's lack of remorse. He had written that Dorothy Mee had brought it on herself, that she should have been honored by his attention, that her refusal had given him no choice. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who was deeply disturbed, who viewed women as objects for his gratification, and who had no moral compass to restrain his violent impulses. But the journal contained something else that made the discovery even more significant. In an entry dated several years later, Pritchard had written about his son Jr., about how the boy had seen something the night of the murder. Jr. had apparently woken up and looked out his bedroom window and had seen his father returning to the house late that night, covered in dirt and acting strangely. Pritchard had caught Jr. watching and had threatened the boy, telling him that if he ever spoke about what he had seen, terrible things would happen. The journal entry suggested that Jr. had been traumatized into silence, that he had spent his entire childhood and adult life carrying the knowledge of what his father had done. When confronted with this evidence, Jr. finally broke. In a tearful confession, he admitted that he had known for more than 70 years that his father had murdered Dorothy Mee Hutchins. He had been 6 years old, terrified, and under his father's absolute control. As he grew older, the burden of the secret had become crushing, but he had never found the courage to come forward. He was afraid of destroying his father's reputation, afraid of what it would mean for his own life, afraid that no one would believe him. So he had remained silent, had lived in the house where his father had kept his terrible secret, and had carried the guilt and shame of his silence every single day. On August 20th, 2024, the Mississippi Attorney General held a press conference to announce the conclusion of the Dorothy Mee Hutchins investigation. They presented evidence that Thomas Pritchard Sr. had murdered Dorothy Mee in 1950, and they announced that Thomas Pritchard Jr. was being arrested and charged with being an accessory after the fact, and with obstruction of justice. The legal theory was that by remaining silent about what he knew, by not coming forward with evidence that could have led to his father's arrest, Jr. had effectively aided his father in evading justice. The announcement sent shockwaves through Coldwater and beyond. The story made national news. A murder that had occurred more than 70 years ago was suddenly front-page news, and a man who had been considered a quiet, harmless member of the community was being arrested in connection with it. The reaction in Coldwater was explosive and divided. Some people felt that justice was finally being served, that Dorothy Mee Hutchins deserved to have the truth known, and her killer identified even if that killer was long dead. They believed that Jr. deserved to be held accountable for his decades of silence, that his failure to come forward had denied Dorothy Mee's family any chance of closure or justice. The few surviving relatives of Dorothy Mee, including a niece who had been born after the murder, spoke publicly about their relief that the case had finally been solved. They said that Dorothy Mee's daughters, both of whom had died in recent years without ever knowing who had killed their mother, would have wanted the truth to be revealed. But other members of the community felt that the arrest of Jr. was unjust and cruel. They argued that he had been a child when the murder occurred, that he had been terrorized into silence by a violent and dominating father, and that he should not be held criminally responsible for actions he took or failed to take as a traumatized 6-year-old child. They organized rallies in support of Jr., raised money for his legal defense, and circulated petitions asking the Attorney General to drop the charges. They argued that pursuing an elderly man for something that had happened when he was a child was vindictive and served no purpose. The case became a flashpoint for larger debates about justice, about whether there is a statute of limitations on moral responsibility, about the difference between legal guilt and moral culpability. Legal experts debated whether the charges against Jr. would hold up in court. Some argued that a 6-year-old child cannot be considered an accessory to a crime, and that Jr.'s failure to come forward as an adult was not, strictly speaking, a criminal act since he had not actively participated in the murder or helped his father escape. Others argued that Jr.'s silence, maintained for over 70 years, had prevented justice from being served and had caused immeasurable pain to Dorothy Mee's family. They contended that once Jr. became an adult, he had a moral and legal obligation to come forward with what he knew, and his failure to do so made him complicit in the crime. The trial of Thomas Pritchard Jr. began in the spring of 2025. The courtroom was packed every day with media, curious onlookers, and members of the Coldwater community, both supporting and opposing Jr. The prosecution presented the journal Helen Morrison's testimony, the testimonies of women who had been victimized by Thomas Pritchard Sr., and Jr.'s own confession that he had known about the murder for decades. They painted a picture of a man who had chosen his own comfort and his father's reputation over justice for an innocent victim. They acknowledged that Jr. had been a child when the murder occurred, but argued that he had been an adult for more than 60 years and had made the choice every single day not to come forward. They argued that this silence had been a deliberate act that had obstructed justice and denied closure to a grieving family. The defense presented a very different picture. They brought in psychologists and trauma experts who testified about the long-term effects of childhood trauma, about how fear and intimidation can silence victims for decades, and about how someone living under the control of an abusive parent might never feel safe to speak out. They presented evidence of Thomas Pritchard Sr.'s domineering personality and his reputation for violence. They argued that Jr. had been a victim too, a child forced to keep a terrible secret by a father he feared, and that he had lived his entire life in the shadow of that trauma. They contended that prosecuting him was a miscarriage of justice that compounded the original tragedy rather than addressing it. The defense also challenged the legal theory underlying the charges, arguing that there is no law requiring citizens to report crimes they have knowledge of, that Junior had not actively participated in the murder or the cover-up, and that his silence, while morally troubling, did not constitute a crime. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The testimony was emotional and wrenching. Sarah Reeves, the graduate student whose research had reopened the case, testified about what she had found and why she believed it was important to pursue the truth. Helen Morrison, now 97 years old and frail, was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair to testify about what she had heard that night in 1950 and why her father had lied to protect Thomas Pritchard. Her testimony was powerful and heartbreaking. Junior himself testified, and his testimony was perhaps the most compelling part of the trial. He spoke haltingly and with great difficulty about the night he had seen his father return home, about the terror he had felt, about the threats his father had made. He talked about living his entire life with the knowledge of what his father had done, about the nightmares and the guilt, about wanting to speak but being paralyzed by fear and shame. He said he knew his silence had been wrong, that he had failed Dorothy Mee and her family, but he insisted he had never intended to obstruct justice, that he had simply been too broken and afraid to do the right thing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they delivered a verdict that reflected the complexity and ambiguity of the case. They found Thomas Pritchard Jr. guilty of obstruction of justice, but acquitted him on the charge of being an accessory after the fact. The distinction was significant. They had determined that his silence had indeed obstructed the investigation and prevented justice from being served, but they had also recognized that he had not actively aided his father in committing or covering up the crime. The judge, in sentencing Junior, took into account his age, his lack of any criminal history, the extraordinary circumstances of the case, and the decades of psychological torment he had endured. She sentenced him to 5 years in prison but immediately suspended the sentence, placing him on probation instead. She said that while Junior's silence had been wrong and had caused harm, putting an elderly man in prison for traumas inflicted on him as a child would serve no legitimate purpose of justice. She said that the truth had been revealed, that Dorothy Mee Hutchins' name had been cleared of any insinuation that she was responsible for her own death, and that Thomas Pritchard Sr. had been identified as the monster he was. That, the judge said, would have to be enough. The verdict and sentence satisfied almost no one. Advocates for victims' rights felt that Junior had gotten away with obstruction and that his sentence was far too lenient. They argued that he should serve prison time for his decades of silence. Supporters of Junior felt that he should never have been charged at all, that he was a victim being punished for the sins of his father. They argued that the trial had been cruel and had re-traumatized a man who had already suffered more than enough. The community of Coldwater remained deeply divided. Some families stopped speaking to each other over their disagreements about the case. Church congregations found themselves split between those who believed in mercy and those who believed in accountability. The case had forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, about complicity, about the long shadows cast by violence and silence. In the months following the trial, journalists and true crime enthusiasts descended on Coldwater, wanting to tell the story of the 75-year-old murder and the shocking arrest that had resulted. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and the case became a subject of intense national interest. The old Pritchard farmhouse, where Junior had lived alone for so many years, was eventually sold. Junior himself moved to an undisclosed location, seeking to escape the media attention and the judgment of both supporters and critics. Sarah Reeves completed her graduate thesis and went on to work for a nonprofit organization that advocates for victims of unsolved crimes. Helen Morrison passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the trial, having finally unburdened herself of the secret she had carried for so long. The case of Dorothy Mee Hutchins remains one of the most controversial and complex cold case resolutions in recent American history. It raised profound questions about the nature of justice, about how societies deal with historical crimes, and about the responsibilities we bear for the secrets we keep. Some saw it as a triumph of persistence and determination, proof that the truth can emerge no matter how long it takes. Others saw it as a tragedy compounded, a case where the pursuit of justice created new victims and opened old wounds without providing real healing. There are no easy answers, no clear moral to the story. What is clear is that on a summer evening in 1950, a young woman walking to her sister's house was murdered, and that murder sent ripples through time that are still being felt more than 7 decades later. The grave of Dorothy Mee Hutchins is in the small cemetery behind the First Baptist Church in Coldwater. For 70 years, it bore only her name and the dates of her birth and death, with no mention of how she died or justice never served. After the trial, her family placed a new marker beside the original one. It reads simply, "The truth is known." Visitors to Coldwater today will find a town that looks much like any other small southern community, with its churches and its storefronts and its quiet streets. But those who know the story understand that beneath the surface, this town carries the weight of a terrible crime and the complicated legacy of how that crime was finally brought to light. The story of Dorothy Mee Hutchins and Thomas Pritchard, father and son, is a story about murder and silence, about fear and courage, about the price of secrets and the cost of truth. It is a story that forces us to consider what we owe to the dead, what we owe to the living, and what we owe to justice even when justice comes too late to provide the closure or the healing we might wish for. The small house where Dorothy Mee and William Hutchins lived with their daughters still stands, though it has been renovated and expanded by subsequent owners who have no connection to the tragedy that unfolded there. The road where Dorothy Mee was attacked has been paved over, and the pine forest where her body was found has been partially cleared for development. The physical landmarks of the crime are disappearing, as physical landmarks always do with time. But the story persists, passed down through generations, argued over in coffee shops and church basements, analyzed by legal scholars and criminologists. It persists because it touches on something fundamental about human nature and human society, about the bargains we make with ourselves and with each other, about the lies we tell and the truths we hide. In the end, the case of Dorothy Mee Hutchins is a reminder that some crimes cast shadows that extend far beyond the immediate act of violence. The murder took only minutes on a June evening in 1950, but its consequences rippled outward through families and communities and across decades. It destroyed Dorothy Mee's life and shattered her family. It trapped Thomas Pritchard Jr. in a prison of fear and guilt from which he never truly escaped. It corrupted the integrity of witnesses who lied to protect a powerful man. It demonstrated how communities can fail their most vulnerable members by refusing to see uncomfortable truths about respected citizens. And ultimately, it challenged modern society to grapple with questions about how far back justice should reach and what forms justice should take when traditional legal remedies are impossible. Those who knew Dorothy Mee Hutchins in life remember her as kind and gentle, a woman whose worst qualities, if she had any, were that she sometimes worked too hard and worried too much about others. She deserved to walk safely down a country road on a summer evening. She deserved to reach her sister's house and admire the new baby and return home to her husband and daughters. She deserved to live a long life, to watch her children grow up, to know grandchildren, to grow old in the town she loved. Instead, she became a victim, and then a mystery, and finally, more than 70 years later, a symbol of how difficult and how necessary it is to seek truth and justice no matter how much time has passed. Her story is tragic, but it is also important. It forces us to remember that behind every cold case file, every unsolved mystery, every faded police report, there is a real person whose life mattered, whose death deserves to be acknowledged, and whose memory deserves to be honored with truth. The community of Coldwater continues to struggle with the legacy of the case. Some residents wish the past had remained buried, that the investigation had never been reopened, that the town had been left to its quiet obscurity. They argue that dredging up old tragedies and prosecuting an elderly man for childhood traumas served no good purpose and only caused more pain. But others believe that confronting the past, no matter how painful, is necessary for healing and for justice. They argue that Dorothy Mee deserved to have her story told, that Thomas Pritchard Sr. deserved to be exposed as the monster he was, and that the community needed to acknowledge its own complicity in allowing a murderer to live unpunished among them for nearly 40 years after the crime. These debates continue, and they probably will continue for years to come, because the questions raised by this case do not have simple answers. What is undeniable is that the arrest of Thomas Pritchard Jr. shocked the community in ways that even the original murder did not. The murder in 1950 was shocking because it was unexpected, because it shattered assumptions about safety and normalcy. But it was also shocking in a way that was almost impersonal, committed by an unknown assailant for unknown reasons. The arrest in 2024 was shocking in a different way. It revealed that the murderer had been someone the community knew and respected, that he had hidden in plain sight for decades, that people had lied to protect him, and that his own son had carried the burden of knowledge for his entire life. It forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their town's history and about the people they had grown up with. It created divisions and animosities that had not existed before. And it demonstrated that even in a small, quiet town where everyone knows everyone else, there can be terrible secrets lurking beneath the surface, secrets that shape lives and destinies in ways that are only revealed decades later. The legal and ethical debates surrounding the case continue to reverberate through academic circles and legal communities. Law schools use the case as an example in classes on criminal procedure, discussing whether the charges against Jr. were legally sound and whether his prosecution served the interests of justice. Ethics professors use the case to explore questions about moral responsibility and the obligations we have to speak truth even when speaking carries a terrible cost. Trauma experts discuss the case in the context of how childhood trauma affects behavior across a lifetime. Victim advocates debate whether the resolution of the case provided any real closure or justice for Dorothy Mee's family. There are no consensus answers to these questions, and perhaps there never will be. The case is simply too complex, too layered with competing moral claims and practical considerations to yield easy conclusions. For Sarah Reeves, the graduate student whose curiosity and persistence reopened the case, the outcome has been bittersweet. She is proud that she helped bring the truth to light and that Dorothy Mee Hutchins is no longer just an unsolved mystery, but a known victim of a known killer. But she has also been troubled by the consequences of her investigation, by the pain it caused to Thomas Pritchard Jr., and by the divisions it created in Coldwater. In interviews, she has said that she believes she did the right thing, that truth matters even when it is uncomfortable. But she also acknowledges the weight of responsibility she feels for setting events in motion that had such profound effects on so many lives. She hopes that her work will inspire other investigators to pursue cold cases and to remember that victims deserve justice no matter how much time has passed. But she also cautions that the pursuit of justice is never simple, and that those who seek to solve old mysteries must be prepared for the complications and moral ambiguities that often result. As for Coldwater itself, the town continues on, as towns do. The current generation of residents includes many people who have no personal memory of the original crime and who know the story only from news reports and documentaries. For them, the case is history rather than lived experience. But for the older residents, those who remember 1950 or who heard stories from parents and grandparents, the case remains raw and immediate. It is a reminder of how the past is never really past, how events from long ago can suddenly resurface and demand to be reckoned with. The town has gained a certain notoriety from the case, appearing on true crime television shows and in documentary films. Some residents resent this attention, feeling that their community is being exploited and sensationalized. Others have accepted it as simply part of the town's identity now, another chapter in its long history. The final word on the case may never be written because the questions it raises are ultimately about justice and morality and responsibility, and these are questions that every generation must answer for itself. Was it right to prosecute Thomas Pritchard Jr.? Was his punishment too lenient or too harsh? Did reopening the case serve the cause of justice or simply create new victims? Should communities be forced to confront painful histories even when that confrontation causes division and suffering? These are not questions that can be definitively answered. They are questions that each person must consider and resolve according to their own moral compass and their own understanding of what justice requires. What can be said with certainty is that Dorothy Mee Hutchins, who died on a country road in Mississippi on a June evening in 1950, is no longer forgotten. Her name is known, her story has been told, and the man who murdered her has been identified and condemned in the court of history, if not in a court of law. For some, this is enough. For others, it will never be enough. But it is all that 75 years of time and the limitations of law and human nature have been able to provide. The case stands as a testament to the persistence of those who refuse to let old crimes be forgotten, as a warning about the dangers of silence and complicity, and as a reminder that justice, however delayed and imperfect, is always worth pursuing. The truth has been known, as the marker on Dorothy Mee's grave now proclaims, and in a world where so many crimes remain forever unsolved and so many victims remain forever nameless, that truth, painful and complicated as it may be, is something of value.